I'm Telly Mahoney, and welcome to the Good Room, where we have interdisciplinary conversations about what makes a room good. Today we're talking about airports and a good gateway, and I'm excited to welcome Matt Leach, who is part of the design leadership for the Austin Airport expansion, and Wendy Dunnam Tita, the commercial mixed-use market leader at Page. So we're chatting about how airport checkpoints, interiors, and commercial building lobbies can intersect and inform each other. Matt, can you start us off by talking about the Austin Airport Checkpoint 1?
The opportunity for this project was to expand the airport's ability to better accommodate the group of people that were going through this building. And the security needs had changed post 9/11, and they wanted to make sure that they not only improved the throughput, but did it in a way that was a reflection of the values of this place. And that, Austin is a very laid back kind of place where really people are comfortable in their skin. And I think the idea of how do you do something that is very rote and in a way procedural is something that can be thought of as a humanizing process, and to make people comfortable and to set them up to have a very pleasant experience. And we tried to figure out what that would mean. And Austin's a really interesting place because it was settled between Waller and Shoal Creek along the river. And that was a function of it lying between arable land and the hill country and really the edge of the frontier. Austin was a frontier town. And this place wouldn't exist without that geography. And the way that one moved about the frontier was by the ground, but really was about understanding what was happening against the sky. You would look for cypress trees to understand where water was. And we were talking early on in the process about how do we take the idea of where we are in the world at this place and time and make it legible through the design. And that aspect of storytelling was one that the original airport had taken on. There's a lot of art and architecture in the original airport design, through the glyphs, through the wrought iron handrails that Lars Stanley did, through some interesting terrazzo work. And so anywhere you look in the original airport, there was always an opportunity for you to connect at a personal level and say, what is this place? What does this mean for me? And we thought that we could do some of the same things and really make it about who people are at this particular place, and made it about the sky. And so the opportunity was, there was a part of the airport that was undeveloped between the ticketing counter and the concourse, like a little wedge. And we thought that we might do something that was about the sky. And so we found a plan form that was not a resultant, was actually something that was imposed that could be universal, like the circular form that might be about the sky and being able to register the sun throughout.
And I think what's so interesting about that space, and maybe is somewhat different than a building lobby, is that a building lobby is creating a relationship between wherever it's coming from, presumably the street, and if you will, and then what's happening inside. It can have a little bit of a stage set quality to it. It can set tone. It can either bring the street with it into the building, or it can bring what's happening in the building out to meet along that edge and help get the guest ready for whatever's happening inside. And that airport checkpoint has slightly different function in a way because it has so much work to do programmatically, and people are only going through it in one direction because they're leaving. So it's this like departure kind of threshold moment. I guess presumably getting people ready for the experience of, everything that's happening in there. But even though it's quite busy, it has a little bit of a moment of calm in it, which I find different than a lot of other particular spaces that have the same program. To me, just as I experience it, and I didn't have anything to do with the design, it's more like a moment of pause, I think, between things versus being a threshold sometimes. And these kinds of spaces, they have a publicness to them that other kinds of work that we do might not. And I think that is something that I am interested in, is that how does the public transition between outside and inside, and what is the role of that room, if you will. And I think there are a lot of levers to pull on it in terms of how expansive or how dramatic or how much continuity. And, there are certain periods of architecture where, as a movement, that blending, that blurring of lines was definitely a priority. And then there are certain times where the expression of that as a real difference is a priority. I think where we are now is it's really more like, what does the space on either side need that lobby to do? And I think that's what we spend a lot of time on.
I tend to have a very similar perspective. Public architecture is very, very different than work that takes place in the private realm. And I think the best thing it can do is offer a sense of generosity by way of its publicness, right? Like, it's about the constituency, it's about the culture, it's about the society that's a part of, and in a way, it's a reflection of that came before it. Those things as a physical expression of that. And that's true of all the great works of public architecture, that it's more than just a housing a function. It's a representation of that place. And I think with the airport, it absolutely does that in a lot of ways, even though it has a discrete form and you can kind of tell it's a container. When you're in it, it's what Wendy described. It's expansive, it's generous in its views, it's generous in the way it's experienced and the lighting, and then its actual physical nature is something that we determined was important, right? It's an 85-foot tall volume. It doesn't have to be. Most checkpoints are kind of compact. And in contrast to something like commercial space, you are developing an idea about what an experience might be because of the activities that are taking place in there, like whether it's about, having a cocktail or enjoying dinner with a group of friends and trying to facilitate a kind of conversation that takes place in that room. And still in an indoor-outdoor setting that we see all over Austin, the characteristics of that space are going to be quite a bit different than one that is inherently public, because you actually might be going in the other direction, right? Like, you might be trying to create an intimate setting that is still blended, is still this kind of amorphous, fluid condition, but it's not necessarily generous in its expression, even though in its experience it might be, because you have a lot of choices about the variety of experiences one might have in that kind of setting of a commercial lobby that has additional programs layered on top of it.
Yeah, it's, I think about what you just said, and the sort of like, there's a certain container of activity and it's maybe less open-ended. And I think about other roles of that sort of opposite, like a more open-ended kind of commercial experience. And I think about, there's a project we did called Fountain Place Residences in Dallas. And that lobby literally was about creating a relationship to the street that signified that something residential and inviting was happening inside. And so that lobby was almost like a stage set, or it was a visual invitation, if you will, because there was nothing existed like that in that part of town. And people didn't think of this particular site for residential experiences. And there's an absolutely beautiful civic plaza and a really important, iconic Haycock Freed office building next door. And it was clear with the client that they really wanted to make sure that that lobby was a signifier that this was a residence and that people should feel that they will have a different kind of experience coming in. And so we actually really intentionally tried to share with the street and the sidewalk the interior design, what that experience was going to be like. And so in some ways, that lobby was an invitation to have a kind of experience.
What were some of the design elements that helped create that welcoming sensation that somebody might get from the sidewalk?
One of them was light. I think that was one of the really important elements, and not just brightness, but actually the color and the tone of light. So there's an enormous walnut wall that's lit with this kind of honey colored lighting. And so from the street, you're driving by and there's this very crisp green glass building coming down to meet the ground, and all the remaining kind of bits of metal are dark charcoal gray. And so this one wall is just like this warm backdrop, like a wood curtain. And the other is a kind of backlit onyx bar. So it's very glowy and it really looks like a traditional kind of hotel bar in that it's very sparkly and it doesn't look like it's a private place. It's lit in the way that it is inviting you to kind of come in and have more of a hospitality oriented experience. And then the third angle, because there are kind of three major views, is this kind of matte gold tile and a shapely kind of sculptural ceiling that, again, are playing with the contrast and have a bit more of a kind of theatrical quality to them. But the light on each of those moments was really important, so that from dusk kind of onward into the evening, in an area that might not also signify residential experiences or hospitality, that they were very visibly kind of in that realm. So I think light was incorporated how it interacted with certain materials. And then we also used this ceiling element that was sculptural, but also directional. And it really helped get you through the space, kind of told you where to go. And that also, I think, was an incredibly important element. Makes me think about ceilings and how important the checkpoint ceiling is. You mentioned it was 85 feet tall, Matt, but it's a piece of art. It's a thing to look at. It's one of my favorite pieces of that space.
Yeah, early on there was a sketch generated that this ceiling could be like a leaf, again, trying to pick up on this idea that nature afforded this opportunity. But it also, in a way, depending on how you looked at it, was a compass or an orienting device. And so there's a number of different readings that one can apply. And so this geometrically organized ceiling that is a central spine with radiating sort of ribs coming off of it is unique to the span. It's actually an expression of the loads in that ceiling, but more than that, it looks like this remarkable form. And on top of that, we layered a full spectrum color gradient to say something again about how the sun moves through the sky. We knew that wasn't going to be quite enough. Of course, we wanted a rather unique expression of the form and the functional criteria of this room. But we also, like you, thought about what the experience said about, I guess, the goals. And what I mean by that is we didn't know how critical light was going to be, but we knew that we wanted this to be a very soft kind of experience and that the lighting should be commensurately soft. And to support that roof structure, there are very, very deep concentric structural columns that are at every rib that form a sunshade device all around the room. And so you have very, very low glare, very low direct solar gain. And the other thing we did was we made sure that none of the light fixtures in the room were directly visible. And so when you're in that room, like you said, it's a moment of pause. It's like stepping into a courtyard before you go into somebody's front door. And I think that without that, it would have just been one more a kind of barrier between the transaction of getting your ticket and replacing your bags and then getting screened and then going to your gate. Like those are typically broken apart, right? They're not like a fluid experience. And this gives you an opportunity to maybe forget about the getting jostled about in the process.
Talking about that reminds me of like how tactile that space is. And it's a little bit unusual for lobbies to have such a tactile quality because a lot of those spaces you're moving through and maybe your interaction is with the furniture and that's probably as intimate as it gets. But unless you're a certain level of traveler, you have to take your shoes off and you have to actually experience some of those surfaces. And how much did y'all think about how cool that floor would feel and how important the aluminum was and the matte quality of that to someone's feet? Because it is remarkable.
Well, we maybe talked about it in a slightly different way. That is definitely the resultant. And it's interesting because it's come up a couple of times, standing on that floor, which is a matte aluminum tile that's actually a concrete pan. But what predicated it was an understanding that floor was going to be a high wearing floor and that maintaining it was going to show deterioration rather quickly depending on the material. And so we thought that by starting with something that already had a level of imperfection, it would actually wear in, right? It would actually have sort of like the qualities of a classical building that might have stone floors. And when you wear into them over time, they actually develop of remarkable quality that you can't buy. And so we were interested in how that might be a better solution than trying to replicate the terrazzo. And it was because we had to have a raised floor, right? Like what is the best way to approach this? And so we didn't start with what the socks would feel like, but we certainly appreciated that it was a surprise.
Have you read the book on weathering? What is that? Mostasavi? Do you know that book?
I know of it, but I've never had the privilege to read it.
Oh, Tully, there's this remarkable book and it's about just how materials weather and patina and people just don't talk about them as much on the interior. That notion that like as a material changes, if you think about it intentionally, then it can be a part of the design. And there's certainly so many examples of that on the outside, but I don't think people talk about them in the way that you were just describing them on the insides of spaces.
Yeah, it's the legacy of these types of buildings is fundamental to the sort of legacy of the American city, right? Like cities as sort of the economic lifeblood of our country. People are coming and going throughout, and you can think about all the great transit hubs like Penn Station and subways and the TWA terminal in New York and the airports, and putting this building in that context, and also thinking about the era when some of those historic transit hubs were made. It sort of dovetails into this conversation because those are beloved spaces, and they're beloved not because they're crowded or just because they're old, but because they're put together. And I think that we tried to think carefully about how the put togetherness of this room would also be fundamental to its experience. It's actually kind of what you see is what you get. Like that ceiling we were just talking about, it's not really clad. The things in between the structural bits are the structural deck. It's a cell deck, and it happens to be acoustic. And we tried to make sure that that sort of essential quality could carry that story, because we knew that it wasn't something that was subject to change. But as we wore into it and people became comfortable with it, was something that would hold up over time and would be a part of that long story without really knowing where we were headed in this airport that continues to change, but certainly thinking about it at that point in time.
You mentioned the floor design was not necessarily intended to give somebody that pleasurable feeling on their foot, but I'm thinking about this process of security where the equipment can sometimes feel clunky and travelers can often feel overwhelmed in this environment. Were there any elements of the design that you specifically curated to make that experience a little more humanizing?
Well, I might misquote this, but there is a famous quote in designing these types of spaces that you've got to make space for the cigarette machine or the phone booth. And I think when you think about a room that is so grand, it has the ability to deal with the clutter that's just associated with what you're dealing with procedurally. And if you can make those things go away, the person doesn't focus on it, right? It's like when you're a kid and you're getting a shot and they distract you for a minute. And we did talk about that a lot. We wanted to make sure that the room was sufficiently distracting because we knew that the equipment was going to change over time, and we knew that the airport was going to bring in vendors and all those other things. And if you look at the original airport, it continues to figure out how to deal with those things. And not all of it's graceful, but surprisingly, it all still holds up to the original sort of diagram. And this room continues to do so as well.
I have to think that the ceiling plays such an important part of that. There are studies about the human brain, and not just that we like taller spaces, but that height activates certain centers of the brain that allow for more expansive thinking. And I think that is, really true in that one. Like you could be in a narrow space and your brain is shutting in and focusing on like the immediate tactile quality that may be pleasant or unpleasant. But like in that space, it would be really curious to see brain level activity in a confined checkpoint versus this really tall one.
I saw there was a study in the Journal of Environmental Psychology that found people who were in spaces with a higher ceiling actually perceived it as more beautiful, opposed to a space that had a lower ceiling. And I find that interesting because often design decisions are driven by the idea of beauty. But in an airport design, of course, the security needs to be prioritized above all else. But I'm curious, Wendy, in a building lobby, how you might balance the conflicting ideas of beauty and aesthetics with security needs.
One of the things that is great about giving a feeling of security is just being able to see things and just to have visibility, to be able to get your bearings wherever you are gives people a higher level of security. And so thinking about the sequence of moving through space and being able to see where you're going, where you've come from is intuitively just good planning. But then there are times when you physically have to shut something off. And as much as possible, we really try and integrate that into the architecture and the interiors as much as possible. Fountain Place residences also had some needs for security. And we actually designed these gates that essentially are steel and brass mesh pieces of art that happen to have the ability to lock off a space at the end of the day. And so they're intentionally designed to be artful and tactile and beautiful so that even if you come up to them and you can't get on the other side, like it's a really nice moment and a thing to look at and touch, and light passes through it and you can see what's beyond. So I think there are definitely things that we do as designers to help people have a sense of security, and then to make the security points as beautiful as we can.
I hadn't thought of this till now, but it's interesting to imagine what an airport would be like if you didn't actually see the security components. And I don't know if it's good or bad, but the thing that's interesting about the thought exercise is, like, we did a state hospital, and it was really, really important to the leadership that bringing somebody into the hospital there was no barrier to actually getting somebody into the building, because the success of their care depends on them not perceiving the building as a threat, which is kind of counterintuitive to security in an airport. Like, in some ways, you want the role of security to be imposing, that it's a serious thing that's taking place, and that, in a way, a deterrent. If the airport said, actually, should be a thing that is secondary to everything else, I think it would be very different. Like, you could see airports there, you could distribute it, right? Like, instead of it being concentrated into a thing where there's a crowd and it's like, next, bring out your passport. It would just be this thing that you get your coffee and, like, oh yeah, by the way, could you step through this? And there was this sort of automatic moment where you don't even know that you've just been scanned. And that serendipity of security is something that takes place when we're taking care of one another anyway. And I wonder what that would look like if it was integrated into more public spaces. Maybe we wouldn't worry about having to be delayed for 3 hours because we wouldn't even perceive it. It would just be like, you're on this beautiful walk that happens to be this interior space. I don't know, but it's a funny thing to consider, because it doesn't have to look like that, you know. But it would definitely transform the way we think about not just airports, but all public spaces. I mean, this conversation is taking place across the country in schools, and it's terrifying, right? I mean, nobody wants to send their kids to a place that looks like it's actually a military encampment. And I don't think most schools do, but this is what buildings say, and this is why the built environment is so important, because it does have an impact on who we are and how we comport ourselves around one another.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think a lot of older airports were a little bit more permeable in that way, because you could just sort of drive up and walk on the plane. I mean, I think it goes back to that idea of, can a building be an invitation? And if it's not, then to your point, it has to, there are certain ones where really it's signifying that it's not an invitation unless you've, met these requirements. And that's really, that must be such a tough thing for educators in schools right now to sort of figure out, because I think there are people who don't want it to look like an invitation. And that's a hard thing to work through.
It can be counterproductive too, because if a building is defensive or aggressive in its appearance with respect to these things, sometimes it's an invitation too. And again, it's just what we say with our work. And so I appreciate how, in a way, invisible those things are at that airport. And that room, it can be lined up all the way to the other side of the transaction lobby, and it never feels crowded. And it's remarkable. Like, those machines just go away.
I wouldn't be surprised if in 10 years we don't have to see so much of that because of all the other kind of sensing technology, and then we'll have a different discussion.
The compartmentalization, I think, it will remain the biggest challenge of that experience. But it would be amazing if there was something like, you go through security and then you can go into a garden, right? Like, you can just hang out in a courtyard. And I don't smoke, but if there was a place to, like, just step outside and regather yourself, like, that would be extraordinary. And if we could figure out how we get past that, where it can be a little bit more fluid, it might actually also help the people who run these kinds of places, because they've got more choices about how they organize their spaces. Some of our new work on the west end of the airport tries to tackle these things expressly. There is an outdoor terrace that we've added, so that'll be really exciting. You can step out, not quite a courtyard, but at least a distraction, right? A removal from the hubbub inside. And then there's a chapel and a meditation room and some other things that will let you sort of unplug for a minute. I think giving people that choice is really important.
Do you think there's any elements of the building lobby that could be integrated into the airport checkpoint to help tackle these challenges?
Some airports are the exception to this, of course, but from one end to the other, even if there are differences that are, or uniquenesses to the phase with which the airport was built, there's a goal to sort of make it all sort of feel singular in its experience or its brand expression or whatever. Like, you still know that you're in the Austin airport from one end to the other. That tends to be a goal. But the thing that's wonderful about lobbies that are commercialized is that on the same block, you can go from one place to another, to another, to another, and have 5 or 6 different lobbies all within a very compact place and have very different experiences. So if, even if I'm waiting for Wendy to come down and we're going to go get a meal, if I'm decide that I actually want to hang out in the lobby next door, I have that choice, and they might actually be interconnected with a door. There's nothing that says you couldn't take the same approach in designing an airport, right? It might be something that actually is an expression of its development over time. And in some ways, if it were more like a city, that might be remarkable, because it's inherently scalable. It's not necessarily bound by the diagram that it has to be complete, right? It's inherently open. That's like kind of the wonderful thing about a city. And if you can think about how those things change over time and the different kinds of experiences they can afford, maybe a new type of airport emerges.
Yeah, it's a collection of scales. When you were describing that, I was immediately thinking about the Indeed lobby and how your proximity to a historic building is so different than if you were, on a stair looking through a curtain wall. And those are, in some ways, like if you were looking straight east and straight west, you would have very different kinds of city shaping experiences. And I don't know that we think about those lobbies as a collection of volumes of space, because they're oftentimes thought of as a singular volume of space with continuity. Although I will say a commonality in that particular lobby and others that we've done maybe has a bit to do with detail. And I think that if we're thinking about good rooms, that's something that is worth talking about. Sort of what's the level of thought behind not just a space that could be a block long, for example, and half a block wide, or whatever amount of scale that's somewhat monumental. But what's the level of thought and intention that goes into, an individual inch or 6 inches, or what patterning is integrated into that? Because these are spaces that, the same person could come and go 3 times a day, every day of the year, potentially, especially if it's a residential building lobby. And so what's the level of thought behind the amount of integrated detail and design?
Yeah, it's a really interesting discussion about the opportunity of detail in one's experience of a place. And I think you and I approach this at very different scales. I'm not quite as interested in the resolution of detail at a fine level as I am interested in its ability to carry a level of fiction. And a very normative way of thinking about this is that a detail is an expression of construction, right? Like how things come together and how artfully that's put together is usually what one thinks of when they think about detail. But in the airport, for example, we were trying to carry this story of fiction that the room was about how light was shaped by its form. And the depth of those columns was on the one hand structural, but it was also about they were slightly exaggerated, right? So that they would actually be the way the light would hit them would be a little bit more dramatic. That's not really about expressing the construction as much as it's about heightening the story about the way that the environmental characteristics are shaped by how this thing was put together and the decisions we made about how it was put together. And that's the kind of stuff that is fun for me, is more like thinking about architecture like a movie, like you think about Star Wars or Harry Potter. Those are such different settings, but that story could not be told without a setting that is about the story. And I think about that all the time. We were talking about Indeed, and that building is about the lobby being an extension of the public realm. And so it was really, really important that it kind of dissolve at the edges to be an extension of the street. And having the opportunity to tell that story with their work, I think, is the thing that really gets me going. And then working with people like you who really, really care about, no, let's shape it slightly differently because it will be read as exceptional, right? Like as an extraordinary thing that somebody thought about that was done with care. I am so glad to have people around me that are a little bit more invested in that.
It's really interesting to hear the different perspectives about detail. Thank you, Matt and Wendy, for joining me today on this episode of The Good Room, and thank you for listening.